welcome back to the course. It's good to see everybody. And of course, we've just come back from our reading week, and a tremendous amount has happened in the world since then. We've had the US election. That's probably enough by itself. And obviously there's many other things going on as well, but it feels like a really fitting time to be welcoming Daniel Schmachtenberger back to Sensemaking 101. And before handing over to Daniel, we're really excited to have back, of course. I wanted to just recap where we are in the process, where we are in the course. So the course moves from inside to outside. So we started really by developing some capacities and skills that we need to make sense effectively and to understand ourselves more, really, to develop our discernment, to understand where our cognitive biases might lie, to understand how rejecting certain aspects of ourselves create shadows that then change how we interpret the world around us. And then with Diane Musho-Hamilton, right before the reading week, we looked at relating. We started moving outwards a bit to looking at what shows up between us as we come together in any kind of group. So how sameness and difference shows up, and how that plays out in small groups, but also on a bigger scale. And this week, we're really expanding outwards. Now we're really in the sections where we're trying to do our best to apply some of the skills we've learned to making sense of the world around us. And arguably, there are a few people who are more adept at doing that than Daniel Schmachtenberger. So excited to have Daniel back. And the format is going to be similar to previous sessions. So Daniel's going to talk for around 10 or 15 minutes around sense making in this time and place where we find ourselves now, and some of the key topics we need to be aware of when we're making sense and as we're approaching our information ecology. And then we're going to have an inquiry. So we're going to break off into small groups and do an inquiry, and then come back, and it's just going to be Q&A from then. So some people have submitted questions on Circle, so thank you for that. And then also it's always quite alive when we choose questions from the group as they're coming up. So what we're going to ask this time is that you put your questions, not right now, but after we come back from the breakout, that you put your questions in the chat. And if you see a question from someone else that you really like, you do +1 their name, so that we get a sense from the whole group of what's really alive and what people really would like to inquire into. So we'll recap that again when we come back from the break. And Ivo's here as well. Hey, Ivo.
Hey, everyone. Good to see you all.
Cool. So we are, I think we'll really just launch right in. And Daniel, really good to have you back. Thanks for being here again. And how are you doing?
I'm good. I'm happy to be here with everybody. Thanks for having me back.
Pleasure. So Daniel, I thought it'd be interesting to start. Obviously, this is a huge topic, and there's many different places we could start, but perhaps a fitting place is the challenges of trying to make sense of what's going on right in this moment in history, as we're sort of in a world between worlds. And then within that, with the results of the US election and what's going on, we're in another kind of very uncertain time. And so I thought we might start just by asking what is the role of an individual within this kind of information landscape? Like what are some of the capacities and some of the ways we can approach starting to make sense more effectively right now?
So we've done a whole series on sense making with Rebel Wisdom. I'm going to assume that people have either seen those or that they can, so I won't repeat stuff that's in that series. So just what kind of comes to mind right now, based on what you said this course has been looking at. Couple quick thoughts in terms of the role of the individual. It's important to understand how much we didn't evolve for the kind of information processing we're experiencing right now. So it's actually not natural from a kind of evolutionary sense. Obviously, our genes have not went through major evolution since the Industrial Revolution, even the agricultural revolution, and definitely not since the information revolution. Mostly we evolved to be making sense of a world that we could sense with our senses, and where most everyone we would interact with in our tribe could sense the same thing we could with our senses, and we could all basically have the same sensing on base reality. And where we weren't trying to make sense of what was happening on the opposite side of the world that might be consequential to what's going on for us now, or where we're not trying to make sense of a bunch of invisible things like climate change and viruses, where we either have to know all the sciences very, very well, or we have to trust some authorities. Like these are unique situations. Because believing what the rest of the group believed was generally more adaptive than disagreeing with what the rest of the group did in a tribalist context, we have a groupthink bias that is stronger than most anybody wants to admit, that is wired in. And we just suck at noticing our own bias. We're usually pretty good at noticing other people's biases. They're usually pretty good at noticing what they think is ours, and we're pretty good at getting defensive about it. I saw this shirt that was like a humorous shirt, but it says, "I already believe whatever conspiracy theory comes out next." And it's funny because it's like we know that person, right? We all know a lot of that person, that whatever it is that Bill Gates or the Illuminati or the Bilderberg does next, they probably already believe that thing because they're oriented to believe stuff like that. It fits the kind of narrative framing and tropes and things that they believe in. And similarly, we could have another one that says, "I'm already debunking the next conspiracy theory that comes out next, but I'm assuming that I'm going straight to debunking it before actually giving any possible credence to it." Those are biases, right? The bias of, am I more likely to do one than the other? And you could say, well, no, it's not bias, it's learning. I have looked at these a lot in the past, and I'm statistically saying most of the time it turned out such and such. The difference between bias and learning is a thin line, because bias is something that was programmed in the past where we're overgeneralizing and applying it to a place where it might not apply now. So our perception of the current moment. Obviously, learning is a way to try to accelerate our ability to make sense of new things. But to the degree that we're perceiving what we are projecting on reality before we're perceiving new base reality is the degree to which the previous learnings that might not be appropriate are going to become bias. And so one way you can identify it is in yourself. Say you're studying COVID. You might have already flip-flopped throughout the time of COVID, where you notice that you either kind of have some sense that when you're reading something about whether the viral origin was natural or man-made, that when you start reading it was man-made hypothesis, you're just kind of skimming through to see where it was debunked, and as soon as you see that it was debunked, you feel comfortable, and then you kind of move on and don't need to see the details. And you notice that what you're looking for, where there's more information than you can take in fully, is something that is confirming a particular direction on it. Or the other way around, you're looking to see where it probably was an actual bioweapon, but you notice that what you're skimming for is something that has confirmation bias built in, where you end up feeling satiated. You're like, oh, that same amount of information wouldn't have satiated me on the other side. Just notice those things. Something else I would say that's important is to recognize that in that evolutionary environment, if someone was lying to me, it was a person talking to me with a lot of body language and who still couldn't control what their pheromones and, other aspects of their system that were communicating with me were saying. And there's a certain kind of symmetric dynamic between them as a person and me as a person. But when the information that is coming into me is being prepared by either multi-billion-dollar organizations or whole government bodies, or the preponderance of info is the Facebook, Google sorted kind of belief bias orientation of those multi-billion-dollar companies that really represents multi-trillion-dollar information landscapes. It's a very asymmetric info war, right? Let's say I'm trying to make sense of COVID. So what the fuck am I going to do to be able to sense the base reality better than John Hopkins could do, or the CDC or the WHO, or these huge organizations with labs and big funding? And so I either just kind of have to believe them, or if I disagree, am I even qualified to disagree? Like, do I have the basis to really be able to do that? There is a way of doing it. But if you don't start by the assumption that you're going into an asymmetric info war where you're on the bad side of that asymmetry, then you're not going to prepare properly for what it takes to do it. In which case, the way to try to, for most people, the way to pare down the extent of that asymmetry is to have a bias of what kinds of groups and what kinds of people you likely want to defer your belief to, without doing all of the work it takes to figure it out, and which ones you probably want to assume are the bad guys doing the asymmetric info war. Mostly, I would say anyone who can control asymmetric info power to various degrees has played the game of power effectively, and there is some degree of complicity of power games that are not fully honest, regardless of political orientation or anything else. So where today, almost everyone is pretty comfortable with the idea that there's fake news. It's just they hold it in too partisan a way, right? The left thinks the right's news is fake and vice versa. And what I would say is that kind of as you go up in the stack of power, you get people that are better at the stack of power, which involves how to broadcast messages that lots of people believe. Those are a couple initial thoughts.
Great, thanks. And then I think a question that's come up a lot, Daniel, is so as individuals, you've laid out some of the challenges we have in making sense, but if we're going to come together and try and make sense together, which I mean, in a sense, your Consilience project is a collective project, right? It's a gathering together of lots of different people, lots of different skills. Not so much how do we do that, but I mean, what are some of the considerations of doing that now? And for example, what are some of the things you're running up against with the Consilience project? What are some of the necessities for us to be able to come together in that way and make sense together?
I mean, the foundational necessary but not sufficient. The foundational necessity is earnestness to really want to know what is going on about something. Now, sensemaking is not the end of the thing, right? Sensemaking doesn't solve a single environmental issue or social issue. It just helps me maybe understand the issue well enough to know what a good solution would be. I still have to be good at problem solving and then have to be good at implementation, which is mostly where the really hard work comes in. It's just, if I can't do good sense making, I won't know what is a good solution. And I won't know that what I think is a good solution isn't externalizing harm to some other adjacent but connected area. So let's even say that I have a sense, let's say I feel like I've done good sense making of a specific space, like climate change. Well, like COVID, we'll just take a classic example. We've done good enough. Let's go back to May or June or whenever it was. Okay, we've done good enough sense making to say viral transmission is following transportation routes. And that's both commercial and commercial kind of airline transport, but also industrial supply chain stuff. So we're going to close that down for a while as part of lockdown to stop viral transmission. That makes plenty of sense. And from a viral transmission standpoint, it's true. But of course, if shutting down the supply chains in a world that is completely dependent on supply chains with almost no stocks and flows in, almost no kind of resource buffer, ends up leading to the radical food insecurity it did in Nigeria or in parts of the Middle East or in parts of Northern Africa or in India, because of a breakdown in the flow of the pesticides or the fertilizers or whatever that were needed for like basic life support, you can end up causing a problem that is much worse than the problem you were trying to solve, because your sense making couldn't just be viral transmission. If it touched a world that had a lot of other adjacent things, it has to be viral transmission and the adjacent landscape so that your solution is sufficient. So very often what will happen is somebody will do not bad, but partial sense making. They'll come up with a solution that makes plenty of sense. They will be focused on the issue that they care about, and they will see how important that issue is. The fact that it will cause harm somewhere else, they're not really noticing, because that's not the somewhere else isn't the issue space they're really focused on. The people who are focused on that other thing see that this thing that's trying to go through is causing massive problems to something they care about. And now you have political polarization of two groups that both care about real things and both have good partial sense making about real things. But where you have a theory of trade-offs between benefit one thing at the expense of something else or not, and you have to be able to say, okay, well, all these things matter, they're connected. Is there a better solution to be able to deal with these landscape of things? Is there a more synergistic satisfier? Well, that requires being able to really listen to and try to understand the point of view that you currently think is the batshit crazy one, because it's trying to prevent the thing that you're trying to do that you know is super important. And maybe even there is something batshit crazy in their point of view. They have to deny that COVID is real or climate change is real or whatever. Okay, look past that. Why? What is it that is real that they're focused on? Is there a real thing there? Oftentimes the answer is yes. And this is why the orientation to seek those perspectives and to seek the true parts of them is so important, to be able to have higher order sense making that can possibly come up with solutions, because the whole purpose of sense making is a prerequisite for solutions. But if we have a solution that we're trying to implement that half the world is doing everything they can to prevent, we don't really get anywhere with global solutions. All we get is massive coordination costs and internal tensions that end up leading to their own problems, war and things like that. So we have to do a better job of remembering that the people we disagree with don't stop existing because we think they're wrong, and they don't stop being political actors. And if we just try to win, whatever we do that's effective, they'll reverse engineer and try to do. So you just drive arms races. We actually have to say, okay, well, what is it? What are the values that everyone's orienting towards? And what is the partial data they're orienting towards? Can we actually have a good conversation around that? The saying by von Clausewitz that war is politics by other means. The other direction is the important direction, which is politics is the thing we invented to try to sublimate war with people who have different beliefs than us or different desires than us. And most people can end up being fairly naive about the ugliness of war or the cost of it or the ineffectiveness of it. So shared conversation and compromise is how we have to deal with that.
Yeah, thank you, Daniel. And before we do it, we're going to do a short breakout, guys, a short inquiry of just over 10 minutes. But before we do that, a couple of people asked questions in Circle who can't be here today. So I thought it'd be nice to ask one of their questions before we go in. And there's one from Katie Fox, and I'm going to post it in, I'm going to read it out, Daniel, but I'll also post it in the chat so everyone can see it. And it's regarding creating the anti-rivalrous dynamics you have described so well. What would it mean for us to win? And what would that look like? What seeds of this have you seen in the most promising existing collective practices?
Sure. Rivalrous means my win requires somebody's loss. Non-rivalrous means my win and their win are simply decoupled. I can win and they can win or lose. Anti-rivalrous means my win and their win are coupled. So rivalrous, anti-rivalrous just means that there is some kind of symbiosis, some kind of mutual benefit. It's not actually a very strange concept. I mean, kind of classical liberal market theory suggested that this was the case in markets as a whole, that the supply side could only win if it offered something that the demand side wanted. And so there was an exchange, but everybody was enriched by the nature of that exchange. Of course, you end up getting where is the cost and harm externalized somewhere along the supply chain? And did that require positive sum dynamics? It requires growth of the materials economy that can't keep happening on a finite planet. But the idea that if you want to sublimate warfare, you have to get some kind of win-win is not a new idea. It's just, how do we think through it better, more competently? So, I mean, I'll just give you a very simple example in the Consilience project, part of how we set that up, which is, getting relatively close to launch. January is our anticipated date. We set a 5-year time to live for the project. It's a nonprofit project. And setting the time to live, meaning after 5 years, we close the project. There's a few reasons. One is we are not trying to vie for a position of power in the media landscape. And we want to make that clear to anyone who might think that's a desirable thing and want to come into the org and steer it in that way, but also to everyone else who has a hard time trusting media for rightful reasons, that there is no long-term power landscape goal, that there's no long-term career option or long-term kind of like career ladder climbing. And so often nonprofits become jobs programs. And that our long-term success won't happen through us continuing to implement things, which is we have a focus of how do we do sense-making movement building? How do we identify all the groups that have really good data sets, open source intel tools, good vertical news, good education, and help upregulate them and host innovation prizes for new projects and things like that, and help teach people how to do better sense making so demand changes, which puts pressure on the supply side of media to meet better demand. Our long-term effect on shifting culture has to happen through other groups. Like, we actually fail if we don't get other groups to succeed. And we have a finite time to do it. So we created an incentive for us where no one else that's trying to do good work could see us as in competition, because we actually fail if we don't help lots of other groups get more traction than they are. And we'll have a public postmortem evaluating that. So that's an example of, a particular strategy to think through anti-rivalry. Obviously, we could take any example of a work someone wants to do and just say, where could rivalrous dynamics be? And what are solutions to be able to create more shared incentive from those who would otherwise be incentivized to stop the project through better design?
Awesome. That's great. And I should have asked this before, but could you, in a couple of paragraphs, just to explain what the project is for people who aren't familiar with it?
Sure. I mean, it's obviously has a related aim to what Rebel Wisdom and kind of other organizations in this space that I think a number of people here are connected to. Our general aim is to facilitate cultural movement towards better sense making and better dialogue writ large as an upgrade to the kind of fabric of society. And what we'd say is that all of the large global complex problems require that half of the population is not actively resisting them to be implemented, require that the next administration doesn't reverse everything after 4 years, and require that we're not externalizing harm to another problem in the process of trying to solve this one. They're all complex and have externalities, and they all require more wide buy-in. So if we don't have a situation where the public writ large is actually doing better sense making and engaged in better public discourse for better collective sense making, we can't solve any of the real catastrophic or SDG level issues. And particularly in a democracy or a republic, the idea of a participatory governance. In a participatory government, there's this idea that we don't need some small set of rulers to lead us. We can rule ourselves because we can all make sense of the issue and we can come together and create good propositions and have some process of collectively choosing what a good proposition is. But obviously, in a situation where we increase polarization rather than increase coherence, and the coherence would happen through shared sense-making conversation, this is why democracies and republics break down after often shorter time periods than autocracies do. And so we'd say that that is kind of a new cultural enlightenment that has to happen. And we can think about the European Enlightenment having had lots of flaws and also some very significant advancements. And we can think of the classical Greek and Roman Enlightenment similarly having lots of flaws, but the advancement of, by an enlightenment, what we generally mean is that most societies have historically had a priestly class, whether it was the academic philosophers or priests or academics, but a small class of professional knowledge workers whose job it was to actually make good sense of things, and to usually inform a political class who would autocratically implement things. And then almost everyone who wasn't trained in sense making, because they didn't really have any significant choices anyways, and it didn't matter. They were laborers, they were doing whatever they did. A cultural enlightenment is when the knowledge that was normally contained to a priestly class starts to become available to and uptaken by the population outside of that class more widely. And the idea that like education for all, to where everyone can understand reality enough that they could participate with meaningful governance choices. And obviously both our education, our training of people to be able to make sense of the issues in the world and to be able to communicate effectively and problem solve effectively is currently inadequate to the problem space. And then obviously the news that is supposed to be giving people the data about current events has devolved into having perverse incentives that are almost all politically and market aligned rather than just maintain the info commons. So our goal is basically launching something that's like news, what's actually happening in the world, and meta news, what's happening in the information landscape. Why are there these different trending narratives? And then teaching people, as we make sense of them, walking people through the process of here's how we're making sense of this. So we're actually teaching people sense making, the highest leverage aspects of sense making for making sense of the current kind of geopolitical, social, technical world, through the process of helping them make sense of the current issues they want to make sense of. And while doing that on the content side, helping movement building to try to help lots of other projects get ground and succeed. That's the gist. That's the gist of the thing. And it's, mostly how do we upgrade the public conversation space to be actually useful rather than continuing to degrade towards either war or defecting to autocracy. And also a strange attractor for those who are most oriented to earnest sense making and good dialogue, because that group of people is capable of generating a lot of other problem solution sets.
Awesome. Thank you, Daniel, for describing it. And so we're going to go into a short breakout now, and then we're going to come back and launch straight into the Q&A. And yeah, I'd really invite people to use this breakout as potentially something that spurs a question for you as well. That's the way we've designed it. And the question is, what am I struggling to make sense of in the world right now? So with the focus being on the environment around us, everything we've been talking about here, the information ecology, etc. And yeah, also, it's also an invitation to find where is the edge of your sense making right now? Where is that place where it just, you can't quite, it becomes too complex. You can't quite hold your sovereignty. You can't quite get there. And so we're just going to inquire for about 3 minutes each. We're going to be in quite small groups, and I will send a message when the first person starts. In fact, the person with the longest hair can start first and then go around like that. So I'm going to open the rooms. Just before we go into the actual questions, we thought it'd be cool to just get a sense of just 3 people sharing briefly on, yeah, what came up for you when you inquire into this, where the edges of your sense making? And Simon volunteered himself by typing something into the chat. So we're gonna get Simon.
Thanks. Look, it was a bit of tongue in cheek. It seems like, and the inquiry is great and getting much better at it. But I think with this one in particular, the stuff that is really at the edge of your sense making often is the real big problems that weigh heavily, that you just can't see a way through and can't see a way forward. So maybe frustrating would have been a better word than depressing, but it'd be lovely to fix these things.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. We got the sense with the emojis that it was tongue in cheek, but no, I appreciate you putting it into the space as well. And Gerald, you've got your hand up as well. Is it just to check? Because I'm not sure if it came up before we announced this. Is it to share what just came up? Is that what you wanted to?
No, it's for a question coming up.
Okay, we'll come back to that as well. Just if anyone has any, Robin, go ahead.
Thank you. One of the things that came up for both Jochen and myself is a notion. I would use the word of locality, of what is close to me, and of Daniel Schmachtenberger, who was in a group, framed it nicely as something being irrelevant does not mean if I could make sense of it, and if I could turn that sense making into positive action, then I would not, because it wouldn't be relevant. It's about how do I spend my very limited resources and attention. And for both Jochen and myself, we were finding there are things that are non-local, not local to our attention, that cost a lot to try to make sense of and are not the most efficient, or I would add here meaningful places to bring that sense-making capacity and attention.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you, Robin. It's a good point. And I think we'll go into the questions, and actually beginning with Lauren Wilder, because a lot of +1s, and I think also somebody else, maybe Deborah, asked a similar question around education. So Lauren, would you like to ask your question to Daniel?
Sure. Hi, Daniel. My question is around, I'm super curious to hear your thoughts on education, especially for ages K to 12, and what do you imagine like a really positive future for education that would foster sovereignty and sense making in these kids? And what would that look like, and what would the tools be?
I'll share a few brief thoughts. If we take a historical perspective on education, we can see that the way educational systems were designed and evolved. I'm going to move back to this other view here, gallery. There we go. The way the educational systems were designed and evolved had a lot to do with the type of social system that we had to be training people to be effective in as adults. And so what we think of as the modern educational system, I'll say the US in particular, emerged following the Industrial Revolution and the need to be able to train people to take positions in that market economy. And that started as like the need for people to the standardization. So standardized SATs and curriculum and metrics meant that we could build these big complex organizations with org charts where I could know that anyone who had a particular kind of degree and a particular kind of grade point average was basically replaceable for anyone else. So I can just say I need X many MBAs in this org chart from good schools, and whether they're from, Wharton or Yale or whatever, doesn't make that much difference. And the same with factory line workers. So the goal of that was largely fungible people that could fulfill particular kind of roles for being able to be effective in economy. There was a guild system before that was a different kind of education to make people effective craftspeople under, say, feudalism. Obviously, education in a tribe was how to develop people that can be effective at the types of things that tribe needs to do. As we look at the way that the world is changing under the kind of, people might call it the fourth industrial revolution, the everything, digital infotech changing everything. Obviously, all of the institutions, economics, governance, et cetera, are going to change. And correspondingly, like with the question of when we don't have to train a lot of people for labor jobs because most of them are automated, what does that mean for how we change the nature of education? And what things won't be automated and what new types of tasks will be there? And what are the kind of, both at the individual level, what are the things that prepare an individual to do well in that world? And at the societal level, what are the collective set of capacities that will make that society function well? Education's expensive. This has been another big part of thinking about it from a societal perspective, is of course it's already the case that K through 12, if you're very wealthy, is a very different quality education than if your kids are going to public school. And so if you can afford it, your kids go to a prep school, they go to Exeter Academy or something like that, and the kind of education they get is totally different. And that is part of how class systems perpetuate, is those who have the access already in upper classes are able to continue to develop the capacity to propagate being in those classes, and vice versa. But like, why, one teacher teaching to 30 students is obviously cheaper than one teacher teaching to 5 students. And an average teacher versus the best teachers are going to be cheaper. And the standardized curriculum will be cheaper than personalized curriculum. So then we have to start saying how much of our, as a percentage of GDP, or however we want to think about it, are we going to invest in education? And how do we justify that in the previous world if almost everyone's going to grow up to be a laborer and they don't need that education? So historically, this issue of how do we deal with the labor economy versus kind of the management or ruling classes as it relates to education has been one of the major parts of how society decided resource allocation. And when we think about technological automation and joblessness as a result of that, we can either see it concentrating wealth even more severely because the labor class now is a useless class and they either move to like serfdom or extinction, or that everybody can actually become capable of engaging in creative connection and knowledge work more interestingly, and we can actually justify kind of higher educational input. This is just thinking about some of the constraints that have been there from a social perspective and how they change. When we talk, if you're thinking more just locally, like my kids, how do I help my kids learn sense making better? Then don't start at K, start at birth. Start at as early as you can, pre-birth, because they're learning language without you even really trying to teach them formal language. They're learning it through osmosis. And as they're learning that language, they're also learning how to make sense of the world and be a person and everything through their early imprinting. And, so like my dad, when I was an infant, was reading to me Bucky Fuller. And instead of reading other bedtime stories, that's what he was interested in reading. That's what he wanted to read to me. So Bucky's language was a lot of my first words. Can a baby say isotropic vector matrix? Sure. Can they understand what that is? Just like they can learn Russian or Icelandic or languages that we might find hard to learn. So what kind of input is coming in is actually a very important question. And then a general principle I'll share for their sense making is because I'm not trying to train them to be a factory worker or even I'm not trying to train them to be a hill climber. I'm trying to train them to be a valley crosser in evolutionary terms in this particular time. Hill climbing means implementing best practices within a known domain. How do we get better at continuing to climb the evolutionary peak we're already on by better implementing the shit we know is successful? Valley crossing is when you've tapped out that hill. There's nothing else to eat. You have to descend into a valley to find a new one. It's a different skill. It's a meta capacity, which is not how do I implement a known thing, but how do I figure out what the relevant thing is? It's even deeper than problem solving, because it's saying, how do I figure out what problems are worth solving? And how do I figure out how to solve new types of problems? So we want to be asking, how do we help develop valley crossers? Because the particular phase of the world we're in right now, that's what's mostly needed. So I want to bring kids to environments where we don't have a structured output of what problem we're even going to solve yet. We're going to figure out together what problem is even worth solving in this particular context. And I don't know how we're going to solve it. And we authentically go through that process together. And where I don't show them how I'm doing it, I try to facilitate the development of their capacity to do that. So if a kid memorizes a date or a mathematical formula, they're just a bad AI, right? They're just a very, very inadequate, shitty AI that will be replaced. I want them to do something that a narrow AI won't do. And that's not going to be memory or application of an algorithm. If I'm trying to get them to kind of apply an algorithm, they'll just be a shitty computer. I want them to be able to have the general intelligence that could figure out new stuff and figure out what stuff is even worth applying. And so in general, when they ask me a question, I'm not going to answer it. I'm going to ask them back what they think about it. And then I'm going to ask them how they would know if their answer was right. And then I'm going to ask them follow-up questions to deepen their epistemics. And I'm going to try to help them come to discovery. And I might teach some stuff in that process, but I'm going to be teaching epistemology primarily and the domain second. And even more than teaching epistemology, I'll be teaching the meta epistemology of how would one even figure out what the right epistemology to apply is. Now, for most people, we couldn't do that with kids because we don't know how to do that ourselves. So what I would say is, knowing that that's what the kids need, if you are in the domain of parenting or teaching, then your desire to help them develop properly is probably a stronger evolutionary motive for you to start engaging in this kind of development with them. And children have often been the best reason for people to transcend their own limitations that they couldn't for their own sake.
Great. Thanks both. And I'm going to call on Helen Hughes, because Helen, you had a nice question about intuition, which you posted in Circle and feels somewhat related to this. So Helen, I wonder if you would like to ask your question now.
Yeah, hello. Yeah, my question was basically about when we're making sense, particularly from you, Daniel, it's very much like intellectual sense we're making of the world. We're taking different information that we're picking up around us and trying to make sense of it in our heads. My question was really about, from a more spiritual point of view, a lot of traditions are looking at the inner voice, the intuition, that perceptive ability within us. How do you use that yourself, and how would you see that playing a part in our sense making?
I won't be able to do adequate justice to this topic, even adequate justice to my own thinking on it, because it's very nuanced. I'll say it with that preface. I'll say a few things. The spirit intellect as fundamentally different than each other meme is it's a dangerous one. So we have to kind of think about, how are we defining intellect and how are we defining spirit? Is spirit some other part of ourself that doesn't include the intellect, or is it the wholeness of self that includes all parts of ourself? When we make spirit some part of us and there are other parts of us, then we can have them in parts conflicts with each other. And to be spiritual, we can reject our intellect because it's some other thing. And we can reject our ego and our whatever. I think this is super destructive. So any definition of spirit that I think is really helpful involves wholeness of self in relationship with the wholeness of world. And I can give you many spiritual texts that talk about the role of intellect in enlightenment or ascension. If you read Shankara's Crest Jewel of Discrimination, one of the great kind of Hindu theory classics, basically he's saying the sixth chakra is the highest in the entire chakra system. That has to do with the pure ability to discern sameness from difference, truth from falsity. When you look at Manjushri, the Buddha of wisdom holds the sword that is the sword of discernment that can separate truth from falseness, and it represents intellect. And intellect and mind are not the same thing in, say the Sanskrit way of describing it. And I would say in cognitive science, we can find a corollary. The thing we call mind often is a bunch of shit that was coded into the software that's running narrative. My name is this, I'm good at these things, I'm bad at these things, I like these people, I don't like these people, this is my value system, whatever, right? And oftentimes there can be destructive software that was coded in there. And so we can talk about the problems of mind, but nobody can live without mind. So it ends up being a useless idea to be negative about mind as a whole. Instead, you want to say, how do I continue to edit and upgrade the software? Because I'm going to have one, right? How do I not be limited to only be that, but how do I continue to upgrade it? But that software is not intellect. You can almost say the hardware, the process, the capacity for compute itself is intellect. That's not exactly the right metaphor, but the capacity to discern truth from falsity has no personal me in it or personal narrative in it. The capacity to discern sameness from difference is at the basis of perception itself. When I'm even sensing something and I'm sensing in the moment the greenness of the tree on the blueness of the background, there's a discernment that's occurring, right? And that's happening through the senses, and it's also happening through, so built into the sensing process is the capacity to discern samenesses and differences. Now, the thing we call intellect is usually where we start to abstract that and not just have this moment of green and blue, but the concept of green across all classes of trees and things that are green and blue across all things that look blue. But that's still, now that's basically taking the sensory experience of discernment and being able to abstract it is a higher order sense of capacity to do it. That is a completely spiritual function that can actually help clear the nonsense bad software of the mind. That's what CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, or Byron Katie's The Work, right? Or Krishnamurti's inquiry are all using the intellect to undo the bad software of the mind. So when Byron Katie asks your belief, this person wronged me, or they should have done such and such, or I'm not good enough at whatever. And she says, are you completely sure that's true? And you're like, well, actually, I mean, I don't know what was going on in their head. I don't even know when I'm not good enough, what metric I'm measuring myself up against. I don't completely know it's true. And through the history of the world, people have believed wrong stuff, certain that it was right most of the time. So it's very easy to be certain of gibberish. So possibly I'm reacting to false certainty. Right now, my intellect is actually what is showing me that the certainty is false, that I don't have adequate basis for it. Right? This is very important. The certainty that I had in mind was actually bad intellect. It was epistemically unwarranted certainty. Then she would ask, okay, so how do you react when you believe that thought? You believe the thought as if it's true. What happens in your emotions? What happens in your perception? What happens in your action? You start to notice all these things. You're assessing the cause and effect of that belief system. Oh, it makes me contract. It makes me less loving. It makes me suspicious. It makes me look for bad stuff about them, whatever it is, right? Well, that clarity is actually showing you the inner mechanisms of how you work that separates you from life, spirit, wholeness, right? Who would I be without that thought? I'm posing to intellect a question to try to say, remove that thought, but keep the rest of me. right? That's an abstract intellectual consideration. What are the turnarounds? Try a different thought on. Okay, well, maybe their intention was such and such, right? That's an alternate hypothesis testing. So the distinction, I'll give you another example. There's a bad interpretation of Eastern wisdom. I'm going to call it bad. That says thinking about the past and thinking about the future are not good things. We should only be in the moment. Not only Eastern wisdom, we can hear Jesus having said that, be like the lilies of the valley, right? Lilies of the field. Because when we think about the past, we can get all into remorse and regrets and melancholy and anger and whatever, and we can get fucked up. When we think about the future, we can get into a bunch of anxieties. And if we're fully here in the moment, we don't have either of those. Okay. Well, if I give myself a lobotomy of my prefrontal cortex, so I am like the other animals, or like a little child who has not yet developed that, I'll never be thinking about the past or the future, and almost no one would choose to do that as a spiritual development method. Because then what we're saying is evolution fucked up and shouldn't have given us a prefrontal cortex. It gave us this thing, and our whole goal is just to get rid of it spiritually, to try to lobotomize a whole capacity. No, it's nonsense. It's just, it's a relatively new capacity, and we weren't trained how to use it, so we can hurt ourselves with a tool. I can use a hammer badly and hit my thumb, but the answer isn't don't ever use hammers, it's learn how to use a hammer properly. So I can also think of the past and feel great gratitude and feel a sense of like appreciation and abundance. I can learn lessons and I can learn lessons from other people's experience and harvest them, so I don't have to go through all the difficulty myself. I can think of the future and actually imagine a more beautiful world and creatively think of how I want to help bring it about. So the unique human capacity for past and future, for self and other, for an abstract sense of self that can give us an ego, we can use them badly and cause pain. The answer isn't to get rid of them, it's to use them better. So we want a healthy relationship with the past, the present, and the future, a healthy relationship with mind, with ego, with intellect, with all the parts of ourself, and how all the parts of ourself come together into a wholeness of self that can be in relationship to a wholeness of life, I would call spiritual. And the wholeness that is not reducible to the sum of its parts, the felt sense of a wholeness and integrity, I would call spiritual. And the intellect can understand its own limits, right? When Gödel came up with the incompleteness theorem of mathematics, he was using formal logic to show the limits of formal logic. So it was able to point, like the Buddhist pointing out instruction, it was able to point to that which is beyond logic, using logic formally. So logic could then surrender to a felt sense of what the Tao is without being illogical, right? Now, I can use intellect itself, or rationality, I can use badly because I don't train it. And this is what all the cognitive biases are, right? The classic example is the pre-Socratic Greeks holding their thumb up to the moon saying, at arm's length, when I close one eye, my thumb blocks out the moon, therefore the moon is smaller than my thumb. Well, that's a rational argument that doesn't factor depth perception and the way that size changes with depth perception. So it's rational, but it's wrong. So to be rational properly requires, this is what learning science and critical thinking and formal logic are all about, right? Is training logic. We can have intuition that's wrong or that is right and meaningful, but it also takes training. Because like that shitty logic, without training, most people's intuition is actually just an expression of their fears, desires, and biases most of the time. And so people who are scared of Black people will have an intuitive sense when that person comes around who's Black, I can't trust him. It's not intuition, it's bias. Intuition means, for most people, a process that I did not logically come to that I feel. Well, that's also how trauma expresses, right? And so I have to train my intuition to be clear. so in the same way, we have science, math, critical thinking, logic to train the intellect. We don't have in the modern academic canon a way of training intuition, but other developmental systems did. And the core essence, I would say, is the ability to train the quietness of the mind. The quieter one gets inside, and the longer there is quiet, the less it is just automated bias, and the more actually insightful things can emerge. And also the ability to notice our own biases and clear them. And as I heal more of the traumas that create fears, and as I have more of a sense of unconditional wholeness that doesn't have desires that I think are needs, in that subconscious stillness, intuition works much better. And intuition then is a felt sense of something, or a sense of the trueness of something that didn't emerge through starting with data and suppositions and going through logical steps. It emerged in a way where there wasn't necessarily a linear step. But that also doesn't mean that I can't use logic to look at it and verify, right? I can say, okay, this emerged as true. How would I check? In the same way that if I have a logical process, I can also say, does this feel right? If something feels really off about it, I might have had wrong logic. So I want to use my feeling and my thinking in harmony, in coherence, and in error correction of each other. I want to be able to run pure thinking. I want to be able to run pure feeling, and I want to be able to run the relationship between them. So ultimately, all of my inner intelligences are engaging. And what is actually true, if I'm clear, they should all point to. I don't know if that addresses some of the inquiry.
Yeah, no, that's great. Thank you. There's a lot to think about there. I suppose there's a definition of terms, isn't there? There's what's intuition, what is instinct? Do the emotions belong to intuition, which I'd say they don't, but it's a huge area. Yeah, thank you.
And so we can say that it's reasonable to propose that there are different kinds of sensing and sense making, or different kinds of intelligence that we have access to. And the fullest human experience is one that develops all of them and develops their relationship with each other. So I don't have a instinct versus intellect, or instinct versus intuition. I have a instinct and a trained instinct that has, because all of those intelligences can be corrupted and can be trained. And if you're to look at the chakra system as a series of intelligences, that each of the chakras is a center for a kind of intelligence, which is a very reasonable way to think about it in the Eastern traditions. You can think about each chakra having an ordinating set of questions that it's inquiring into in any situation. The center of the will, right? The third chakra. The question is, how do I relate to this situation or topic in a way that empowers me? So it's actually agency, or will has its own intelligence of how to continue to grow agency and will in relationship to a thing. I can't continue to understand a thing or care about it if I can't do anything about it. It'll shut me down, right? So how I become empowered is its own kind of intelligence. And there's lots of people who are good at being able to make sense of something, but become so disempowered that they have to turn off or kill themselves. So there's a kind of intelligence missing, right? Sadly, some of the most utterly brilliant people I've ever met killed themselves young for this reason. And in what we'd call the heart chakra, there's an ordinating question of what is sacred to me, what is most meaningful to me, what is worth endeavoring towards and worth desiring and worth valuing. And that's a different question than what is objectively true or not true. What can I find concordance between abstract belief and base reality? It's a different question. They're all important. to communicate here, right in the throat. To communicate with someone, to commune with them is different than to talk at them. And so if I'm really going to try to communicate with someone, I have to be sensing into what is likely real and alive and meaningful for them, and what is true for me, and how do I communicate what's true for me, and how do I sense if we're actually communing, right? So that is not a objective intelligence, and it's also not a purely subjective, it's an intersubjective. It's a tuning into the basis of communion. The lower chakras involve things that we would call more instinct. So if you're to take a system like that, you can see that whether we're looking at different branches of Buddhism or Hinduism or other cultures had similar things, these ones are fairly easy model-wise. They were looking at processes and practices to develop each, and then to also develop them in relationship to each other. I think I think those are very valuable models.
Wonderful, thank you, Daniel. Thank you, Helen, as well. It was beautiful. I think we have time for about one more question. We've got about 12 minutes or so left. And Jamie, you had a question about hope, which I'm feeling is a nice follow-up to this, a nice place to end this. So I wonder if you would like to ask it. Just wait for Daniel's just adjusting something, so give me a sec. Great.
Sure.
So Jamie. There you go.
Hi, hopefully people can still hear me. I keep getting a message saying that my internet connection is a bit bad, but I suppose the question I wanted to ask is, one of the things that I've noticed in looking at your work, Daniel, is, it's really helped me understand just the level of complexity to all of this. And I suppose in that, the question I wanted to pose is, how do we hold on to hope when sometimes it feels like the gap between where we are and where we need to be is just so far away? And I think when you see that bigger picture, it can sometimes feel like, well, how can I make a difference? How can I contribute to this in a way that's going to feel meaningful? And I just wondered if you had any advice with that.
Sure. Maybe stop listening to things that I talk about, honestly. It's possible that it actually does an injustice sometimes, and it's not my intent, but I'm moving out of the sun here. Understanding the complexity of the issues hopefully can orient someone to get on or deepen the path of learning about the things that they care about. But it's like, that's a path that unfolds developmentally. And so someone has to be able to then start saying there are things I can actually make sense of and do something about, which gives a kind of positive feedback to the process of making sense and engaging agency. And so if you try to jump straight to the most complex interconnected global problems, before having worked with how do I make sense of a problem in my local community and how do I work to solve it and like that, it's kind of like jumping straight to, I'm going to compete in the Olympics in a sport I haven't done very much of, right? You're probably just going to get hurt, but that doesn't mean that someone can't start developing their fitness in a direction and they could, or that they couldn't even get to a very high level capacity, but there's a developmental process. I'm often sharing the things that, I'm trying to figure out, and I've been working on trying to figure those things out for a long time. And largely I'm doing it to find other people that maybe have answers to some of those things, or at least processes, so we can work on some of those together. But it is very important that people have a sense of where they want to go, and then an actual kind of development path of like, am I making progress? That's one answer. We generally don't think that if we're teaching a kid addition or multiplication, that they should feel hopeless about math because they aren't at the edge of the hardest questions known about math, right? And they might someday get to solving Fermat's last theorem, but they're probably going to learn addition first. So it's important to just have a developmental sense where someone actually gets to make real progress. Next thing I would say is it's possible to have a kind of unconditioned hope as a choice that is different than a conditional hope. Like there's a conditional hope that this election will turn out this way, or this particular thing will go this way, that is just either going to happen or not happen, and it's unfounded for me to have that hope. We shouldn't have that. But to have the hope that humanity can figure out some of the solutions to some of the current problems, that innovation kind of can arise, that solution sets are worth pursuing, is what gives us the energy to pursue them, to then start to get a grounded sense. So almost everyone who ever, like the classic, I mean, I'm saying something that has been said so many times, I think it's important. When Napoleon Hill was interviewing Edison after he had invented the light bulb, and he said, Edison, if you hadn't been able to figure out the light bulb, what would you have done? And he said, if I hadn't been able to figure out the light bulb yet, I wouldn't be talking to you. I'd still be in the laboratory working on it. What was it that made Edison fail so many times and keep going? There was some kind of hope or faith in the possibility of a light bulb before he knew how to build it. And then each of the prototypes failed, but rather than give up, he took it as a lesson. Aha, one more way not to make a light bulb. And how do I iterate to be able to come to it? The same thing when Gandhi said, I'm committed to the what because of the why before I know the how. I know, and he said, I know that in his terms, this kind of slavery and oppression of the people is not what God wants. It's not, and another way of saying that is it's not ultimately what is right and aligned with the deepest sense of what good would be. So I know that what is aligned with that will be on the side of solving the problem with me. So I'm going to work on it. So he committed to, I'm going to end this, having no idea how, but he fully committed to it. And how that expressed itself was he said, I'm going to sit here and think about a solution and not do anything else until I come up with one. That's a different level of commitment than most people have, which is why most people don't end up affecting that level of change. But he's like, okay, so we're all going to burn our papers that are the indications of our enslavement to the British Empire. And he had this kind of hope of how well it would go, and it didn't. And he got the shit beat out of him and put in prison. And his friend said, that was really nice of you to try. It's understandable that you failed. It's British Empire and all. And he's like, no, I'm still going to change this. And they're like, how? He said, I don't know, but I'm going to sit here and think and meditate on it until I come up with an idea. And then I'm going to implement that. And then when I fail, I'm going to try again. So he was committed to a what before knowing the how, which is what made him do the depth of focus and iterative work and commitment to problem solving that achieved a how eventually. So you can deepen into your why, commit to what, and then let how be developmental and progressive. But most people will say, okay, I'm committed to that. But then, like Gandhi, they're not saying, I'm going to sit here and think about it and not do anything else. They're like, well, I'm living my life busy with a bunch of shit that isn't the thing I said I was committed to. And a year later, I still have no further idea and I haven't tried anything. That's not really committed. That's like virtue signaling your own self. And a lot of people virtue signal their own self because it makes them feel better. Actual commitment would express itself through change in actions.
Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel. So we only have a couple of minutes left. I wonder, Daniel, if there's anything you yeah, anything that's come up for you that you wanted to express or just kind of leave us with today as we near the end of this course, yeah, focused on sense making.
So in Gödel's incompleteness theorem, when he showed that there is no finite set of arithmetic principles from which all of the consistent arithmetic truths could be derived, which means that the fundamental set of math is infinite, not finite, which is when we were trying to come up with a finite set of math from which all math could be derived. It was one of the most important things that ever happened in math and actually in like logic itself. And oftentimes we hold that as a kind of statement about ontology, that what is cannot be finitely described. But it's also a limit to epistemology, meaning the process of knowing is also not describable in that formal logical system. So, and Tarski extended it from arithmetic to any formal logical system, that the formal logical system can be valid, meaning it's consistent with itself. But for it to be sound, there's the question of how do I know if that is true? I have to have something outside of the system that allows me to say if it is true relative to base reality. And otherwise, I'm still within the system looking at its own validity, right? And so you won't be able to articulate a perfect epistemics for sense making. Do this, then do this, then do this, and then you'll have it. You won't be able to do that. So not only ontologically is the Tao that is nameable not the eternal Tao, epistemologically, the process to generate the ontology of the perfect Tao that is nameable is not the eternal process. Okay? So what that means is you can come up with good epistemic best practices, but you actually still have to think and sense and feel and work at it beyond applying a methodology. Otherwise, a narrow AI would be enough, right? In the breakout group I was in, one of the things we talked about is that it's fairly rare to encounter real thinking. Mostly we encounter meme propagation. So there's a bunch of memes in the world. There's already memes in someone's head that are somewhat intersupportive of each other, usually with a lot of internal conflict they try to ignore. But you have a memeplex of supportive ideas, and then you have a meme filter. And ideas come at you through the news or whatever. And the ones that make it through the filter are the ones that seem like they work with the existing memeplex. And the ones that would not work with the memeplex get bounced off. Then whichever ones come in are coding me not only to see the world a certain way, but to propagate those memes, right? The memes code behavior and code propagation. So then the thing that someone says most of the time is just slightly different wording on something they heard, right? That somebody else said, which means a very good Chinese room, right? A very good, not conscious, just semantic processor like GPT-3 could do just as good a job. GPT-3 is a new narrow AI algorithm that OpenAI came out with recently. And for most people, its responses when you're chatting with it pass the Turing test, meaning you don't know that it's not a person. The thing that I've found is that the average person is more predictable to me than a GPT-3 algorithm. It's actually doing a better job at a wider semantic space than the average person who's become an even narrower memetic propagator. So real thinking means ideas come in and then I actually process them, not just saying, is this idea as it came in true or not, but how would I know? Is it possible that it's partially true? Is there possibly a better idea? Can I generate a novel hypothesis? Can I test it and come up with ideas on it? Do I have my own kind of depth of sensing and experience? That's thinking, right? And also feeling and being engaged beyond just being a propagator, a filter and propagator. And the process by which you do that is not fully explicatable. That's the thing that I was saying earlier. It requires just your full depth of care and earnestness and all of the capacities you have, the ones that you've previously named and ones that are outside of what you've previously named. And kind of in closing that, there's this quote in the book of Ecclesiastes that everybody's heard of. There's a time to kill and a time to heal and to sow and to reap and a time for every purpose under heaven. The way I interpret that is, well, how do I know if it's a time to kill or to heal or to, for any of the things? There is some deeper function of connection to the moment and discernment and like that ends up determining which of the modes is the right mode to engage, but that all modes can be inappropriate and all modes can be appropriate at different times, different contexts. Well, the same is true with truths or kind of sense-making processes. Is this something that I want to use the philosophy of science on, or is this something I want to use communication with a trusted friend group about, or is this something I want to meditate on? Oftentimes, all of those can have some value. And some of them might have more value than others based on the moment. So, but the way I would say it is whatever idea somebody proposes to you as a kind of general truth, there's almost always an idea that sounds almost opposite to it that is also true, that you want to hold in a certain kind of balance. So, you'll hear principles of turn the other cheek, and you'll also hear principles of set good boundaries. And in different environments, they're both true things. And, have empathy for what made someone come the way they are, and call a spade and don't be a sucker. And right. So it's like, for any idea that you would just express as if it's an absolute truth or a platitude, seek what is an idea that seems almost opposite to it, but that is complementary, that gives you a deeper, nuanced perspective. That's a thought I would leave people with.
Brilliant, Daniel. Thank you so much. Thanks for coming and sharing your wisdom. And thank you everyone for asking such brilliant questions as well. It was really, I felt it was a really special session today. So in typical Sensemaking 101 fashion, to invite everyone to unmute and say a thank you and goodbye.
Thank you, Daniel.
Thank you.
Thank
Daniel.
you.
Daniel.
Bye.
Goodbye.
Same as always.
Thank you, Daniel.
Thank you.
Thank
you very much.
Daniel.
Thank you, Daniel.
Be
Thank you,
here,
Daniel.
everybody.